Most musicians and producers know how to grab an EQ and make something sound relatively good, but not many fully understand which filter shapes make the most sense depending on what you're trying to do. And by the end of this video, I'm going to cover every single EQ filter shape, when to use each one, and the pros and cons of each. This video is going to level up your ability to EQ music and make it sound super musical and pro. Now, EQ is not just all about boosting or cutting frequencies. You have to make sure you're using the right type of filter shape for whatever the problem is that you're trying to address. Let's quickly run through what the different filter shapes are for an EQ. Probably the most common EQ shape is the bell filter. It's called that because it looks kind of like a bell shape. What you need to know about this filter shape is it boosts or cuts around its center frequency. So if we set it to 625 hertz and you turn it up, it's going to boost evenly above and below those frequencies. And if you want it to boost further, you can adjust what's called a quality factor, or that Q, and it will broaden or attenuate more frequencies. So a lower Q value is going to be a wider boost, so more frequencies. A higher Q value is more narrow and more focused on specific frequencies that are really, really close to that center that we have it set to. You would use this type of filter if we're trying to clean up boxiness or harshness in a song. So typically, you would do that by cutting those frequencies. If you want to add presence, attack, weight, or clarity to an instrument, that's usually done by boosting. And historically, when you're boosting, it tends to sound a little bit more musical and less harsh if you use a Q value that's a little bit lower. So it includes more frequencies. The analog filters are very broad, and that's that musicality we get from that. The digital domain, we can kind of cheat stuff and make them super narrow, and then that's when we get weird sounding EQ moves. Anytime you really want an EQ value greater than about 2 or 3 is if there's something very specific wrong and you need to notch out an annoying, small, ringy frequency. Otherwise, I tend to keep my EQs between about 0.5 and 2. The major benefit of these bell filters is that they're perfect for tonal sculpting. So where people get into trouble using these bell filters is that they'll just add a ton of different filter nodes, and so they end up over-processing the audio in whatever track that they're trying to EQ. And the reality is just having between like 2 and maybe 4 different EQ nodes is all you probably would ever need to make an instrument sound good. If you need more than that, you have to go back to the original source material and maybe re-record it or try to dial in new tones. Now, I know that's not always a possibility, but we should limit the amount of EQing we're doing because it inadvertently makes the instrument sound really, really weird when you start adding 5, 6, 7 of these EQ nodes. All right, next filter, which is super common. It is the high pass filter, or also known as the low cut filter. This is going to roll off frequencies below our center point where we set the high pass filter. Now, something to note is that if you look on this screen here, we might say it's at 65 hertz, but it's actually rolling off frequencies above that, okay? It's rolling off frequencies almost twice that, all the way up to here, 137 hertz. So just because you have a filter that says low cut, it's not going to cut just everything this frequency and below it. It actually goes higher. Something else to be aware of is how sharp the filter is. With these 12 dB per octave, 18 dB per octave, what that means is it will reduce everything below 65 hertz by about 12 dBs per every octave below that set value. An octave of our frequency is just going to be either double or half of that frequency. For a low cut, if we divide this number by 2, it will be reduced by 12 dB, and I can prove that to you by going down to 32.5 hertz, which is going to be about here, and this should be right around 12 dB of gain reduction, which it is on the dot. Now, sometimes people will think, oh, if I make this really, really, really steep, like 96 dB per octave, that's going to do a really good job of cleaning up all the muddy frequencies. You want to be very careful with this because what you don't see is that this causes significant phase distortion. We won't get into a lot of that, but what you need to know is that it can cause unpredictable EQ moves if you have a lot of tracks that you're summing together into a single source. And if you want to learn more about what those could potentially be, I have an awesome video. I'll put it right up here. What I would recommend is if you do use low cuts or a high pass filter, try to keep it at 18 dB per octave or less. The more shallow the cut, the less phase distortion you introduce. But be aware that if you start going to really, really low slopes, you're going to be rolling off frequencies that are much higher than our set point value here. So when would you use something like this? I use this all the time at 12 dB or 18 dB per octave to get rid of rumbly frequencies out of vocal tracks, out of guitars, and bass as well. It's also really good if you have some bleed on like a snare drum microphone from the kick drum. So this is a good way of just rolling off those frequencies. But again, try to stay around 18 dB per octave or less. If those low frequencies have no reason to be there, that's a good reason to throw on a high pass filter. All right, let's talk about the opposite one. This one is a low pass filter, so it allows all the frequencies below it through, it passes those on, or in other words, this is called a high cut. I use this to tame sizzle, fizzy, gross harshness in my mixes. The other thing this is good for is, let's say you have an element in the mix, like a synthesizer or something, and you feel like it's too close or too far forward or too present in the mix. This is really good at just rolling off the really high frequencies to make it feel like it's slowly getting pushed deeper into the mix and positioning it behind the more important elements of the song. So if you have a vocal that's bright and airy and you have a synth that also has a lot of high frequencies, you might want to use a low pass filter to roll off the top of the synth to make it psychoacoustically fit behind the vocalist in the mix. Now, you need to be careful because very quickly you can make something sound lifeless or dull. And the best way to double check that is to make sure you're not listening in solo, have everything playing together, and then just bypass your EQ or take this filter in and out so that you can really, really hear what the impact in the full context of the song sounds like. If we have something like guitars, I love to roll the really sizzly, gross stuff out. So let's just listen to that. Just to kind of clean it up a little bit. Okay, we can do the same thing with the sub energy. We can put a high pass filter and just tighten up those guitars a little bit. Okay, that's obviously too much. And if we go back this way, we start getting this weird like cabinet resonance stuff that we can hear. So we want to roll a little bit of that off. So I feel like right around here is probably a good spot. Without. All right, the next filter shape is going to be a low shelf or a high shelf. It basically boosts or cuts everything below our selected frequency. And as you can tell, it actually goes a little bit beyond that frequency that we set. Okay, so we're actually cutting beyond the 160 hertz that we have this set to, or boosting if we choose to do it that way. This is a lot more gradual compared to a low pass or high pass filter. The amount of attenuation that we have when we use a low shelf to cut stuff is kind of limited here. So it's not as harsh as something like a high pass filter. And it also doesn't cause as much phase distortion as the low pass or high pass filters. These tend to sound a lot more natural and soft and smooth compared to a low or high cut. And for me, if I think something is tonally imbalanced and it sounds like maybe there's not enough weight on a kick drum or not enough impact, I'll reach for a low shelf just to kind of give it a gentle lift of the entire low frequency side of the instrument. Now, some disadvantages is that because this is a really broad shape, we can introduce additional muddiness unintentionally to our source signal. So sometimes when you use these low or high shelves, if you're boosting, you might need to come in with a bell or a peak filter and then fix any of the muddy frequencies that might be getting raised up from that filter shape. For the high shelf, I like to use these also on the master bus because they're kind of gentle and subtle if you dial them in correctly, and also on vocals. This is a great strategy for adding that top end air to make it really exciting, but you have to be aware that you will be increasing frequencies throughout the top end of the vocal, so you might have to come in with the de-esser to take out any of the sharp transient sounds, but this is a great strategy for really raising up that very delicate, modern pop vocal air sound. The next filter shape is something I actually never ever use, but I feel like we should cover it anyways. It's a notch. What this is just a very, very steep, sharp cut, really, really close to that center frequency that you have. This is used for removing ringing from an audio source. So the only time you'd reach for a notch filter shape is if something is really, really wrong with your instrument that is recorded. So sometimes you have weird overtones that kind of just hum for a really long time. You can use something like a notch filter to go and take that ringiness out of an instrument without affecting the other frequencies that much. So it is very precise. It's more precise than any of the other filters that we've talked about so far. So something you have to be very aware of is it's very easy to misuse this type of filter, especially when you're in solo. Try to avoid that. Now, I said I was going to cover all the filter shapes, so I have to be complete here. We're going to talk about Bandpass filters. This is something I don't use very often. This basically is just going to act like a low pass and a high pass filter together. So you get these roll-offs of the low and high frequencies. If you change the Q, it becomes more narrow. And then you can also change the steepness to make it more like a notch filter that's a little bit wider. When you would use something like this is if you want it to have a certain effect. Like let's say you want a lo-fi sound on something, that's when these bandpass filters actually sound really, really useful. I can't think of another reason why you'd ever want to use something like this, but let me just give you a quick example of me throwing this over this mix, and you can hear how it really makes it sound lo-fi, kind of like a telephone effect. This is great if you have an introduction to a song. You can automate this EQ to move so it kind of builds intensity like this. And then you can widen it. Just for an example. But I never use those, and you probably shouldn't use them very often either. So the last one, I'm going to combine these two together. It's the tilt filters. They have both a tilt shelf and a flat tilt. So basically, it's just like it sounds like a teeter-totter. It's going to adjust one side higher and the other side is lower. Okay, and then that point at which the tilting occurs is the frequency that we set. So these types of filters are really, really useful because there's not a lot of thinking involved. You just raise it up and then move it around until it feels right. This is great for adjusting the basic tonal balance of a source. So if you feel like your instrument is just too bright in general, you can just get a tilt filter, sink down the top end, raise the low end, and just move this around until it feels like it's in the right spot to lower the really harsh, bright stuff and then warm up everything below it. So I find sometimes this is nice on like a master bus or maybe on effects like delays and reverbs when you're just like, it feels just like a little bit too bright right away. You can just throw a tilt filter on and make a small adjustment just to get it positioned in a better state for you to then go and do the actual EQing on top of it. There also is a tilt shelf, which is just like a more chill version of that flat tilt I showed earlier, where instead of just continuously increasing as you get higher, it kind of levels off. Not all EQs are going to have these. These are kind of specialty, but you can very easily make something like this by just adding a low shelf and a high shelf. All right, so let's just quickly do a few EQing demonstrations. So the first one is going to be a drum room. So let's listen to that. So we want to identify what we think is problematic with that. Number one, there really shouldn't be a lot of sub-energy stuff in. So let's put a high pass filter in here. Too much. It's a little bit muddy. Let's tighten it up. Yeah, like right there sounds pretty good. Okay, so that tightens up the low end. I don't like how the cymbals feel a little bit louder than everything else. So I'm going to use a bell-shaped filter to kind of just reduce some of the presence of those cymbals. Like that to me is kind of harsh. So let's make it a little bit broader. We just want to kind of notch it out a little bit, soften that section of the cymbals. Tighten it up a little bit. Yeah, just somewhere right around here. Okay, and I still think there's a lot of extra sizzly stuff that we don't need. This is a drum room. This is not the cymbals. The cymbals sound like this. Okay, so that's all the really high energy stuff. We just want the basic room sound. So let's do a low pass. Too dark. Okay, we got to avoid being too dark here. We'd still want it to sound exciting. Yep, something like that. I think that feels about right to me. And then let's do one more bell filter to just tighten up the mid-range to make sure that we don't have any mud in there. Actually, it's like right here, I think I don't like this. Yeah, I like that. I want to clear out the mid-range a little bit to give the guitars a place to live. So if you look at my moves, right? Q is 1.3, 4 dB, 12 dB per octave at 115 hertz. Q is 1.2 roughly, minus 3.5 dB. So I'm not doing anything too crazy, right? It's all staying between that 0.5 and 2. And I'm just doing a few general moves just to smooth out the source. And then if it still has problems when we're mixing later on, we can go back and do a few more adjustments to make everything just fit nicer. Let's go to vocals. Awakened eyes, never wanted to say. So there isn't any like weird plosive, really boomy stuff going on, but there are some like harsh spots, and I think we might be able to get a little bit of mud out, but we want to leave some in there so that it gives the vocal weight. Awakened eyes, can you come? So to get rid of that really sizzly stuff, let's go up to 18 dB per octave this time. And let's just see at what point we can just kind of take the really, really sharpness off the vocal, but we still want it to have a little bit of air. You cover the truth, I can be anything you dream. Too much. It's all in vain, you've shown up. A soul is created, hopeless. Because we can actually solo what we're EQing out. And that's that nice expensive air that you hear on a lot of modern stuff, but I think it's just too much there. And notice I added a little tiny bit of a bump here. And I like to do that a lot of times when I use these low pass filters, just because it helps to offset the loss of frequencies above that so that it still feels full and exciting, but we're taking that really top end harshness out of the mix. So there's just a little bit too much wooliness here for me. I'm just gonna pull a tiny bit out here. Truth, I can be anything you dream. It's all in vain, you've shown up. And again, this is using that bell filter. So without it, a soul is created, hopeless. Awakened eyes, never wanted to say. Let's switch over to the master bus. So if you felt like it's just too bright, you hate yourself. Wanna kill you to say what you want from me. I see it. You're headed for the. So you can see how powerful something like this is, right? It completely changes the balance of the brightness to darkness. So those pesky drum cymbals are a little bit harsh to me, so let's see what we can do to clean them up. So right around 4K, there's this whistling type frequencies that are driving me a little nuts. It makes the cymbals really harsh. just going to pull a little bit out there. And I do feel like we need to take down the top end a tiny bit. And then pull off a little bit of mud. Right there, right at like 400 hertz. This. So again, we're just using these bell filters. We could consider using a high pass filter here as well. Since this is the overheads, it really shouldn't have a lot of like sub information in it. We do want to keep that fundamental, I think, for the snare. There we go. Without the EQ. Oh, it sounds bad. It just sounds a lot smoother with that in. So what I'd like to encourage you is to stop thinking so much about EQ in terms of what frequency you need to cut or boost, and think of it more in terms of what types of filter shapes you need to solve the problems that you're running into. The shape of those filters is going to matter just as much as how much or how little to cut or boost out of the problem area. So those are all the different filter shapes. Now, let's just run through really quickly a practical use guide for you when you run into a certain problem. So if you need to remove unnecessary low end from an instrument, use something like a high pass or a low cut filter. If that's too aggressive, use something like a low shelf. If there is just too much top end brightness or harshness, use a low pass filter or a high cut. If you're trying to shape the tone or you need to do a surgical cut to make sure that it's balanced right, that's going to be our best friend, the bell filter or a peak filter. Those are both the same thing. If you want to adjust the overall warmth or top end of an instrument, shelves are also really, really good for that. You can also reach for something like a tilt EQ if it just feels like the balance of frequencies is just fundamentally off. If you want a lo-fi effect, definitely go for a bandpass filter. It's also great for special effects and adding a little bit of excitement to an introduction. And once you get these two concepts solidified in your head, EQing is going to be second nature, and you'll just instinctively know what you need to do on every single track to make it sound pro. Now, if you need a little help getting started in all this, I actually have a rock and metal mixing cheat sheet that has a lot of good go-to starting EQ positions for all the different instruments in a rock and metal song. And you can download that totally for free in the description. Be sure to comment below. Let me know what your favorite EQ filter shape is, and if you ever use something like a tilt EQ or a bandpass filter in your mixes. If you think I didn't cover something, or you want me to go more in depth in a certain area, let me know in the comments as well. Be sure to subscribe for more mixing and mastering tutorials. And if you want to support me and this channel, you can join the Raytown Productions membership. There's a link in the description for that. That gives you access to a bunch of behind-the-scenes footage. I have a vocal mixing masterclass back there, and I also drop some fun goodies from time to time as well. My name is Bobby Balo. I'm the mixing and mastering engineer at Raytown Productions, and I'll see you in another video.